The screaming began at precisely 3 minutes past midnight on the 13th of October, 1847. Mrs. Evangeline Whitmore bolted upright in her four-poster bed, her nightgown damp with perspiration despite the autumn chill that permeated Grey Hollow Manor. The sound was unlike anything she had ever heard, not the wailing of wind through the ancient eaves, nor the settling groans of centuries-old timber, but something altogether more human and infinitely more disturbing. It was the sound of children laughing. The laughter echoed through the walls themselves, as though the very stones were alive with mirth, and Mrs. Whitmore felt her blood turn to ice. She had dismissed the servants 3 days prior, unable to afford their wages after her husband's unfortunate demise in the railway accident. The manor should have been empty save for herself and her 7-year-old daughter, Constance, who slept in the nursery 2 floors above. The laughter grew louder, joined by whispers that seemed to seep from the very mortar between the bricks. Mrs. Whitmore clutched her shawl and crept toward the fireplace that dominated the north wall of her bedchamber. The embers had long since died, leaving only cold ash and the lingering scent of burned oak, yet the whispers appeared to emanate from within the chimney itself. "Mamma?" came a small voice from behind her. Mrs. Whitmore spun, relief flooding through her at the sight of her daughter standing in the doorway, her golden curls disheveled from sleep. "Constance, my darling, you gave me such a fright. What are you doing out of bed?" The child's blue eyes seemed strangely bright in the moonlight streaming through the tall windows. "They called to me, Mamma. The Fire Children. They want me to come and play." "Fire Children?" Mrs. Whitmore knelt before her daughter, searching the innocent face for signs of fever or delirium. "My sweet child, you've had a dream, nothing more. There are no children in this house but you." Constance tilted her head, listening to something only she could hear. "They live in the chimneys, Mamma. They've been waiting so very long for someone to play with them. They showed me such wonderful things in my dreams, castles made of coal and gardens of glowing cinders. They say if I come with them, I'll never be cold again." The whispers from the fireplace grew more insistent, and Mrs. Whitmore could swear she heard the sound of small feet scurrying through the flues above. She pulled her daughter close, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You will not speak of such nonsense, Constance. Chimneys are dirty, dangerous places where children do not belong." But even as she spoke these words, Mrs. Whitmore recalled the strange incidents that had plagued the village of Millbrook in recent weeks. The Harrington boy, barely 6 years old, had been found by his governess attempting to climb into the parlor chimney, his small hands and feet already blackened with soot. When questioned, young Timothy had spoken of friends in the fire who had promised to teach him their games. The Pemberton twins had disappeared entirely for 3 days, only to be discovered deep within the chimney system of the local church, their clothes in tatters and their skin stained black as coal. They too had babbled about fire children and subterranean kingdoms where the flames never died. The vicar, Reverend Ashworth, had dismissed these incidents as the overactive imaginations of lonely children, but Mrs. Whitmore had seen the fear in his eyes when he spoke of them. There had been other stories as well, whispered rumors of children emerging from chimneys throughout the countryside, speaking in tongues and drawing strange symbols on walls with their sooty fingers. Now, as she held her own daughter in the flickering shadows of Grey Hollow Manor, Mrs. Whitmore began to understand that these were no mere childhood fantasies. "Listen, Mamma," Constance whispered, her breath warm against her mother's neck. "Can you hear them singing?" And God help her, Mrs. Whitmore could. A melody so beautiful and haunting that it seemed to bypass her ears entirely and resonate directly within her soul. It was a lullaby of sorts, sung by voices that sounded like wind through caverns and flames crackling in hearths. The words, if they were words at all, belonged to no language she recognized, yet somehow she understood their meaning. "Come to us," they sang. Come down, and never leave." "We must leave this place," Mrs. Whitmore said, though even as she spoke, she realized the absurdity of the notion. Where could they go? The phenomena seemed to follow the children wherever they went, and besides, She had barely enough coin to last the winter, let alone secure lodgings elsewhere. Constance pulled away from her mother's embrace, her small face grave beyond her years. "They won't hurt me, Mama. They're lonely, just like we are. They've been trapped in the dark for so long, and all they want is someone to sing with." Trapped. Mrs. Whitmore felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "What do you mean, trapped?" But before Constance could answer, a sound echoed from the chimney that made both mother and daughter freeze in terror. It was the unmistakable scrape of fingernails against stone, accompanied by a rustling that might have been fabric or might have been something else entirely. The sound grew closer, as though something, or someone, was descending the narrow shaft toward their chamber. Mrs. Whitmore snatched a poker from beside the fireplace and pulled Constance behind her, though what good a mere iron rod would do against whatever dwelt within the chimney, she could not say. The scraping grew louder, more urgent, and she could hear what sounded like excited whispers echoing down from the darkness above. Then, with a shower of soot and debris, something tumbled from the chimney into the cold fireplace. It was a child, though one unlike any Mrs. Whitmore had ever seen. The creature, for she could think of no other word to describe it, appeared to be roughly the same age as Constance, but its skin was the color of charcoal and its hair hung in matted ash-gray tangles. Its clothes, once perhaps the simple garments of a chimney-sweep's apprentice, were now little more than blackened rags that seemed to writhe and shift in the dim light. But it was the child's eyes that truly terrified her, eyes that glowed like embers in a dying fire, filled with an intelligence that was both ancient and profoundly alien. The fire-child smiled, revealing teeth like chips of coal, and extended one soot-stained hand toward Constance. "Come and play," it whispered in a voice like ashes settling in a grate. "We have such games to show you." Constance took a step forward, her own eyes beginning to glow with that same unnatural light, but Mrs. Whitmore grabbed her daughter's arm with such force that the child cried out in pain. "Stay back." Mrs. Whitmore brandished the poker, though her hands shook so violently she could barely maintain her grip. "Whatever you are, you will not take my daughter." The fire-child tilted its head, regarding her with something that might have been curiosity or amusement. "We do not take, woman of flesh and fear. We invite. We welcome. Your daughter has already heard our songs in her dreams. She has already seen our realm beneath the world. The choosing is hers alone." More sounds echoed from the chimney, the scraping of many small hands and feet, the whisper of many voices calling Constance's name. Mrs. Whitmore realized with growing horror that the fire-child was not alone, that an entire colony of these creatures dwelt within the network of chimneys and flues that connected every building in the village like a vast underground circulatory system. "What are you?" she gasped, backing toward the door while keeping Constance firmly behind her. The fire-child's smile widened, and when it spoke, its voice was joined by a chorus of others, creating a harmony that seemed to make the very air vibrate. "We are the forgotten ones. The lost ones. The children who climbed too high and fell too far, who breathed smoke instead of air and found sustenance in flame rather than food. We are what becomes of innocence when it is consumed by necessity." As if in response to these words, images flashed unbidden through Mrs. Whitmore's mind, visions of small children, some no older than 4 or 5, forced to crawl through narrow chimney shafts to clean them of soot and debris. She saw them coughing up black phlegm, their lungs slowly poisoned by the very air they breathed. She witnessed them falling from great heights, their small bodies broken against the stones below. She watched them burn when chimneys were lit unexpectedly, their screams echoing unheard through the darkness. These were the climbing boys of London and every other great city, the child laborers who risked their lives daily so that the wealthy might enjoy clean, efficient fires in their grand homes. Most died young, their bodies worn out by the brutal work and the toxic environment in which they toiled. But some, it seemed, had found another fate entirely. "You died," Mrs. Whitmore whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "All of you. You died in the chimneys. Death, the fire child mused, its ember eyes flickering. A word with little meaning for those who have transcended flesh. We found a different path, a transformation that allowed us to become one with our prisons. The soot flows in our veins now, and the flames sing in our hearts. We have built a kingdom in the spaces between stones, a realm of eternal warmth and constant light. More fire children began to emerge from the chimney, each one unique yet bearing the same coal-black skin and glowing eyes as the first. Some appeared to have been climbing boys, their bodies small and wiry from years of squeezing through narrow passages. Others looked as though they might have been serving girls or chimney sweeps' apprentices. All bore the marks of their former lives, burn scars, twisted limbs, the hollow cheeks of chronic malnutrition, yet they moved with a fluid grace that seemed to defy their apparent injuries. "We do not force," the first fire child continued, its voice now clearly audible above the others. "But we invite. The living world has grown cold and cruel, especially for the young. Below, in our domain, there is only warmth and wonder. Your daughter could join our games, learn our songs, discover the secret pathways that connect all places where fire burns." Constance pulled against her mother's grip, her eyes never leaving the otherworldly children who beckoned to her from the fireplace. "They're beautiful, Mama. Can't you see how beautiful they are?" But Mrs. Whitmore saw only abomination, the corrupt remnants of human children transformed into something that belonged neither to life nor death. "Beautiful?" she said, her voice sharp with revulsion. "They are creatures of nightmare, Constance. Whatever spell they have cast upon you, you must resist it." The fire children laughed at this, their mirth creating a sound like wind through a forest of dead leaves. "Spell?" said their apparent leader. "We cast no spells, good woman. We merely offer truth. The world above grows darker with each passing year. The gap between rich and poor widens like a chasm, and it is the children who fall through the cracks. Here at least all are equal. Here all are loved." As if to demonstrate their words, the fire children began to sing in harmonious voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with longing and promise, and Mrs. Whitmore felt her resolve wavering despite her terror. The song spoke of safety and belonging, of a place where hunger and cold could never touch, where children could play forever without fear of the harsh realities of the world above. Constance swayed to the rhythm, her small body leaning toward the chimney as though drawn by an invisible force. "Please, Mama," she whispered. "I want to go with them. I want to see their kingdom." "Over my dead body," Mrs. Whitmore snarled, pulling her daughter toward the door. But as they reached the threshold, she found their way blocked by another fire child, this one clearly female, with long hair that moved like smoke in an unfelt breeze. "That," the girl creature said with a smile that showed too many teeth, "can most certainly be arranged." The poker slipped from Mrs. Whitmore's nerveless fingers as she realized the true scope of her predicament. The fire children were not confined to the chimney in her bedchamber. They could move freely through the entire network of flues and passages that honeycomb the manor. There would be no escape, no sanctuary, no safe place to hide from their otherworldly influence. "What do you want from us?" she asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. The fire child who blocked their path cocked her head, studying Mrs. Whitmore with eyes like dying stars. "From you? Nothing at all. You are too old, too set in your ways, too afraid to embrace transformation. But your daughter, she has the gift. She can hear our voices clearly, see our realm without fear. She would make a wonderful addition to our family." "Family." Mrs. Whitmore clutched Constance tighter, feeling her daughter's small body trembling with either fear or excitement. "You speak of family while attempting to steal my child?" "Steal?" The fire children laughed again, and this time the sound seemed to come from the walls themselves. "We steal nothing. We rescue. How long do you think your daughter will survive in this cold, empty manor? How long before hunger claims her, or disease, or any of the 1,000 other perils that beset mortal children. We offer immortality, safety, purpose. A purpose cleaning chimneys for eternity? Mrs. Whitmore's voice was thick with disgust. What kind of existence is that? The lead fire child's expression grew serious, almost sad. You understand so little. We are not servants anymore. We are masters. The chimneys, the flues, the passages between buildings, these are our highways, our domain. We travel where we will, see what we choose, no secrets that no living soul suspects. The wealthy warm themselves by fires we tend, never realizing that we watch them through the flames. The powerful speak their schemes before hearths we inhabit, unaware that their words travel through our realm to be heard by all our kind. As the creature spoke, Mrs. Whitmore began to grasp the implications of what it was saying. If these fire children truly could move through any chimney, hear any conversation held near a fireplace, observe any activity in rooms where fires burned, then they possessed a network of surveillance that spanned the entire civilized world. The thought was terrifying, and in its own way, magnificent. We know which merchants cheat their customers, continued the fire child, which politicians take bribes, which priests break their vows in the darkness. We see the cruelty of parents behind closed doors, the desperation of the poor, the excess of the rich. Knowledge is power, and we have knowledge beyond measure. Constance pulled free from her mother's grasp and took several steps toward the fireplace before Mrs. Whitmore could stop her. The fire children parted to make room for her, their ember eyes bright with anticipation. "Don't you see, Mamma?" Constance said, her voice filled with wonder. "They're trying to help. They're trying to make things better." "By stealing children?" Mrs. Whitmore moved after her daughter, but found her way blocked by more fire children who seemed to materialize from the very shadows. "By saving them," corrected the lead fire child. "Every child who joins us is one less victim of the world's cruelty. Every transformation is a rescue from a life of suffering." "And if they refuse?" Mrs. Whitmore demanded. The fire children exchanged glances, and she saw something flicker in their unnatural eyes, something that might have been regret or might have been hunger. "Refusal," said their leader quietly, "is always an option. But few choose to refuse once they have seen what we offer. And those who do—" The creature's voice trailed off meaningfully. Mrs. Whitmore felt her blood turn to ice as she understood the implication. "You kill them. We end their suffering," the fire child corrected. "There are fates worse than death, good woman. We have seen them all." As if summoned by these words, new sounds began to echo through the manor. The scratch of many feet in the walls, the whisper of many voices in languages both familiar and strange. Mrs. Whitmore realized that the fire children were not alone in their supernatural realm. Other things dwelt in the spaces between spaces, and not all of them were as seemingly benevolent as these transformed chimney sweeps. "You have until dawn," the lead fire child announced, and suddenly all of them began to withdraw toward the chimney. "Choose wisely. Your daughter's future, and your own, depend upon it." One by one, the fire children disappeared up the chimney shaft with impossible grace, their glowing eyes the last thing to vanish into the darkness above. The supernatural light faded from the room, leaving mother and daughter alone in the pale moonlight. Constance turned to her mother, her blue eyes bright with unshed tears. "They're not monsters, Mamma. They're just children who want to be loved." Mrs. Whitmore sank into a nearby chair, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. "They are dead things, my darling. Whatever they once were, they are no longer human." "But they could be again," Constance insisted. "They showed me in my dreams. They could become human again if enough living children joined them willingly. The transformation would reverse, and they could return to the world above." This was new information, and Mrs. Whitmore felt a chill of understanding. If what Constance said was true, then the fire children were not simply recruiting new members for their underground society. They were working towards some greater goal, some apocalyptic transformation that would allow them to reclaim their mortality at the cost of innocent lives. "How many?" she whispered. "How many children would it take?" Constance tilted her head, listening to voices only she could hear. 100, she said finally. 100 willing souls to break the bonds that tie them to the darkness. Mrs. Whitmore closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what she had learned. If the fire children succeeded in their recruitment, if they convinced 100 children to undergo their transformation, then they would somehow regain their humanity and return to the surface world. But what would become of the recruited children? Would they take the fire children's place in the realm below, condemned to an eternity of servitude in the spaces between stones? The implications were staggering. These creatures had essentially devised a way to cheat death itself, but only at the cost of condemning others to the fate they wished to escape. It was a perversion of natural law that made Mrs. Whitmore's soul recoil in horror. "We have to stop them," she said aloud, though she had no idea how such a thing might be accomplished. Constance shook her head sadly. "You can't stop them, Mama. They're in every chimney, in every house, in every city. They've been growing stronger for decades, gathering more children, learning more secrets. Soon they'll have enough to break free. Then we must warn people," Mrs. Whitmore said desperately. "We must tell the authorities." "Who would believe us?" Constance interrupted. "And even if they did, what could they do? Block every chimney? Stop every fire? The fire children would simply wait. They have all the time in the world." Mrs. Whitmore realized her daughter was right. The fire children had created a perfect trap, using the very infrastructure of civilization against itself. Every building with a fireplace was connected to their network. Every family that relied on fire for warmth was potentially at risk. The creatures had been patient, methodical, building their strength while remaining largely unseen. But now something had changed. Now they were actively recruiting, which meant their grand design was nearing completion. "Why now?" she asked. "If they've been waiting so long, why reveal themselves now?" Constance's eyes grew distant, as though she were listening to voices from far away. "The world is changing," she said in a voice that seemed too old for her years. "Soon there will be new ways to heat homes, new ways to cook food. Gas lamps and electric lights will replace candles and fireplaces. The fire children's realm will shrink, their power will diminish. This may be their last chance to return to life." The Industrial Revolution, Mrs. Whitmore realized. The very progress that promised to improve life for the masses would eventually spell doom for the fire children's supernatural kingdom. They were making their move now because soon there might be no chimneys left for them to inhabit. It was a race against time, and the stakes were the souls of England's children. A new sound echoed through the manor, the slow, measured toll of a church bell in the distance. Mrs. Whitmore counted the chimes. 1 o'clock in the morning. 5 hours until dawn, 5 hours to make an impossible choice. "There might be another way," Constance said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Whitmore looked at her daughter sharply. "What way?" "The fire children aren't the only ones who have learned to live in the spaces between," Constance explained. "There are others, older things, stranger things. Things that were never human to begin with." A chill ran down Mrs. Whitmore's spine. "What sort of things?" "The smoke children speak of them in frightened whispers," Constance continued. "Ancient spirits that dwelt in these lands long before the first chimney was built, before the first fire was lit. They were bound by the same forces that transformed the climbing boys, but they are far more powerful. And they remember what the world was like before humans filled it with stone and soot." Mrs. Whitmore felt a growing sense of dread. "You're talking about summoning something to fight the fire children?" "Not summoning," Constance corrected. "Awakening. The old spirits sleep in the deepest places, but they can be roused. The question is whether we would survive their awakening, or whether we would simply be trading one supernatural threat for another far worse. Before Mrs. Whitmore could respond, the whispers began again, not from the chimney this time, but from the walls themselves. The fire children were listening, she realized, monitoring their conversation through the network of passages that connected every room in the manor. "They know," she said urgently. "They know what you've told me." Constance nodded calmly. "I know. They've been listening the whole time. They wanted you to understand the full scope of their plan, to comprehend the futility of resistance. But they don't know about the old spirits. That knowledge comes from somewhere else entirely." "Where?" Mrs. Whitmore demanded. Her daughter's eyes took on that distant look again, and when she spoke, her voice carried an odd harmonic quality that made her sound like multiple people speaking in unison. "From the stones themselves. From the earth beneath our feet. From the memory of the world before fire was tamed and chimneys rose toward the sky." Mrs. Whitmore stared at her daughter in growing horror. Constance was changing, she realized, not into a fire child, but into something else entirely. The conversations with the supernatural creatures had opened some channel in the girl's mind, some connection to forces that existed beyond human understanding. "Constance," she whispered, reaching out to touch her daughter's face. The skin was warm, but there was something else beneath it, a vibration, as though the child's bones were resonating like tuning forks. "I can hear them all, Mama," Constance said, her voice filled with wonder and terror. "The fire children, the old spirits, the voices of everyone who has ever died in these walls. They're all speaking at once, telling me their stories, sharing their secrets. And they all want the same thing, to live again, to feel again, to matter again." The church bell tolled again, marking the quarter hour. Mrs. Whitmore felt time slipping away like sand through her fingers. Whatever was happening to her daughter, whatever transformation had begun, she sensed it could not be stopped. The supernatural forces at work were too powerful, too ancient, too deeply woven into the fabric of reality itself. "What must I do?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Constance took her mother's hands in her own, and Mrs. Whitmore gasped at the contact. Through her daughter's touch, she could suddenly perceive the vast network of supernatural activity that surrounded them. Not just the fire children in their chimney realm, but layer upon layer of otherworldly entities that existed in the margins of human awareness. Ghosts and spirits, yes, but also things that had never been human, ancient intelligences that observed the world through cracks in reality. "You must choose," Constance said, and now her voice carried the weight of ages. "Let the fire children complete their transformation and return to life, knowing that 100 innocent souls will take their place in the darkness. Or wake the old spirits and risk unleashing forces that could destroy not just the fire children, but everyone and everything in their path. Is there no third option?" Mrs. Whitmore pleaded. Constance smiled sadly. "There is always a third option, Mama. You could let me go with them willingly. I would become their bridge between worlds, the one who helps them understand the realm above. In return, they would limit their recruitment to the truly desperate, children who face starvation, abuse, or worse fates. It would not end their plan, but it would make it more humane." The church bell tolled the half-hour, and Mrs. Whitmore felt the weight of decision pressing down upon her like a physical force. 3 choices, each one monstrous in its own way. Condemn 100 children to save 100 others, unleash ancient evils to combat modern ones, or sacrifice her own daughter to moderate a supernatural atrocity. As she wrestled with this impossible dilemma, new sounds began to echo through the manor. Not the whispers of fire children or the voices of ancient spirits, but something far more immediate and terrifying, the sound of footsteps on the stairs outside her chamber. Someone was coming. Mrs. Whitmore grabbed the poker once more and moved protectively in front of her daughter. "Who's there?" she called out, though her voice cracked with fear. The footsteps paused, then resumed their slow, measured ascent. Mrs. Whitmore could hear breathing now, not the labored gasps of someone climbing stairs, but the deep, rhythmic inhalations of someone who had been running for a very long time. The door to her chamber creaked open, and a figure stepped into the moonlight. It was a man of middle age, his clothing torn and stained, his face gaunt with exhaustion. But it was his eyes that truly frightened Mrs. Whitmore, eyes that held the same ember glow as the fire children, though dimmed and flickering as though the light within were dying. "Mrs. Whitmore," the man said, his voice rough with smoke inhalation, "my name is Thomas Ashworth. I was once the chimney sweep for this district, before—" He gestured to his transformed appearance. "Before I learned the truth about what dwells in the darkness between stones." "You're one of them," Mrs. Whitmore breathed. "You're a fire child." Ashworth shook his head. "I was, once. But I found a way to partially reverse the transformation, to regain some measure of my humanity. It came at a terrible cost. Most of my supernatural abilities are gone, and I age now as mortals do. I have perhaps days left to live. But I came to warn you, and to offer you information that might save not just your daughter, but countless other children as well." "What information?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, though she kept the poker raised defensively. Ashworth moved slowly into the room, his movements careful and deliberate. "The fire children are not the architects of their own plan," he revealed. "They are pawns in a game played by something far older and more cunning. The entity that truly controls the realm between spaces has been manipulating them for decades, convincing them that their grand transformation will restore their humanity. But it lies. The ritual they're planning will not free them. It will make them permanent prisoners, and the children they recruit will not take their place but will simply swell their ranks." Constance stepped forward, her eyes wide with shock. "That's not what they told me. They said—" "They believe what they were told," Ashworth interrupted gently. "As I once believed. But I went deeper into the realm than most, explored passages that even the fire children fear to enter. I found the true master of that domain, and I learned its real purpose. It does not want to return to the world of the living. It wants to expand its influence, to transform more and more children until the boundary between its realm and our reality dissolves entirely." Mrs. Whitmore felt her legs grow weak. If what Ashworth said was true, then the fire children were not the primary threat. They were merely the visible symptom of something far worse. "What is this entity?" she asked. "It has many names in many languages," Ashworth replied. "But in the old tongue of these lands, it was called the Soot Father, a primordial spirit of consumption and transformation that feeds on innocence and grows stronger with each soul it claims. Long ago, it was bound by ancient magic to the spaces between human dwellings, prevented from directly entering our world. But as cities grew and chimneys multiplied, its prison became a kingdom. Now it seeks to complete its long-delayed escape." The church bell tolled 3/4 of the hour, and Mrs. Whitmore realized they had less than 4 hours to prevent an apocalypse. "How do we stop it?" she demanded. Ashworth smiled grimly. "There is a way, but it requires great sacrifice. The binding that contains the Soot Father can be reinforced, but only by someone who willingly enters its realm and speaks the ancient words of containment. That person would become a permanent guardian of the barrier between worlds, keeping the entity imprisoned for perhaps another 1,000 years." "And the fire children?" Mrs. Whitmore asked. "They would remain as they are," Ashworth admitted, "trapped in their transformed state, but no longer under the Soot Father's influence. Over time, they might find their own way to redemption, or they might fade away as their artificial existence finally comes to an end." Mrs. Whitmore looked at her daughter, seeing the conflict in the child's glowing eyes. Constance had become a conduit between worlds, but she was still, fundamentally, a 7-year-old girl who wanted to save everyone and hurt no one. "I'll do it," Constance said suddenly. "I'll go into the realm and speak the binding words." "No." Mrs. Whitmore grabbed her daughter's arm. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself for this madness." "Then I'll do it," Ashworth said quietly. "I'm dying anyway, and I have some knowledge of the ancient language. It may not work. I'm not purely human anymore, and the binding requires human sacrifice. But it's worth attempting." Before anyone could respond, the whispers began again, but this time they carried a note of panic. The Fire Children were afraid, Mrs. Whitmore realized. They had been listening to the conversation, and they understood that their carefully laid plans were in jeopardy. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and suddenly the air in the room began to shimmer with heat. Mrs. Whitmore smelled smoke and saw flames beginning to lick at the edges of the fireplace, though no fuel had been added to kindle them. "It knows," Ashworth said, his face pale with terror. "The Soot Father knows we've discovered the truth. It's coming." The flames in the fireplace roared higher, and shapes began to move within them. Not the small, childlike forms of the Fire Children, but something vast and terrible that seemed to fill the entire chimney system with its presence. The temperature in the room began to rise rapidly, and Mrs. Whitmore felt her nightgown beginning to smolder. "The ancient words," she gasped, pulling Constance away from the fireplace. "What are the ancient words?" Ashworth began to speak in a language that sounded like wind through caverns and the crackling of burning wood. The flames responded to his voice, growing brighter and more aggressive, and Mrs. Whitmore could see something enormous moving in their depths, a face that might have been formed from smoke and shadow, with eyes like burning coals and a mouth that opened onto infinite darkness. The Soot Father had come to stop them personally. The entity's voice filled the room like the roar of 1,000 chimneys, speaking in that same ancient tongue. Whatever it said caused Ashworth to stumble backward, blood streaming from his nose and ears. "It's too strong," he gasped. "The binding won't hold without a pure human sacrifice, someone untainted by its influence." Mrs. Whitmore looked at her daughter and saw the terrible truth in the child's eyes. Constance had been partially transformed by her contact with the supernatural realm. She could no longer serve as a purely human sacrifice. And Ashworth's own transformation disqualified him as well. That left only Mrs. Whitmore herself. She understood now why events had unfolded as they had, why she had been chosen to face this horror. Not because she was special or powerful, but because she was ordinary, a human mother willing to sacrifice herself to protect not just her own child, but all the children who would otherwise fall victim to the Soot Father's expanding influence. "Tell me the words," she said to Ashworth, stepping toward the blazing fireplace. "Mother, no." Constance grabbed her arm, but Mrs. Whitmore gently pulled free. "This is what mothers do, my darling," she said softly. "We protect our children, no matter the cost." Ashworth began to speak the binding words again, and Mrs. Whitmore repeated them phonetically, feeling their power resonate in her bones. The Soot Father's roar of rage shook the entire manor, and she could see Fire Children tumbling from the chimney in panic as their master's fury disrupted their realm. She took another step toward the fireplace, the ancient words flowing from her lips with increasing confidence. The flames reached out toward her like grasping fingers, but she did not flinch. Behind her, she could hear Constance weeping, but also beginning to speak the binding words in harmony with her mother's voice. The combination of their voices seemed to have an effect that neither could achieve alone. The flames flickered and wavered, and the Soot Father's roar became tinged with something that might have been uncertainty. Mrs. Whitmore realized that while she might be the sacrifice required, her daughter's partial transformation made her a bridge between worlds, able to channel the binding power more effectively than any purely human voice could. "Together," she whispered to Constance. "We do this together." Mother and daughter stepped forward as one, their voices rising in unison as they spoke words that predated human civilization. The Fire Children scattered like leaves before a hurricane, their own voices joining the chorus now, not in support of their master, but in rebellion against the entity that had deceived them for so long. The Soot Father's form began to writhe and contract within the flames, its massive presence slowly being compressed back into the spaces between spaces. But with each word of the binding, Mrs. Whitmore felt something of herself being pulled into that otherworldly realm. She was becoming the seal that would hold the entity prisoner, and once the ritual was complete, there would be no return. "I love you," she whispered to her daughter, feeling her physical form beginning to fade. "Never forget that I love you." But as the binding neared completion, something unexpected happened. Thomas Ashworth stepped forward and placed his hands on both mother and daughter, his own dying form beginning to glow with an inner light. "A guardian needs assistance," he said with a sad smile. "And I've been partially transformed already. Perhaps the three of us together can maintain the binding while still retaining enough of our humanity to eventually return." The ancient words reached their crescendo, and the three voices merged into something that was more than human, more than supernatural, a harmony that seemed to rewrite the very laws that governed the space between worlds. The Soot Father gave one final, earth-shaking roar before being compressed into a form no larger than a burning ember, contained within a cage of crystallized sound and solidified will. Mrs. Whitmore found herself standing in a place that was neither her bedchamber nor the Fire Children's realm, but something between the two. Constance was beside her, no longer a child but not yet an adult, transformed into something ageless and eternal. Ashworth stood with them, his dying form renewed and strengthened by the binding ritual. "How long must we remain?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, looking around at the strange space they now inhabited, a pocket dimension created by their combined sacrifice. "Until the world above changes enough that chimneys become obsolete," Ashworth replied. "Until the very concept of the spaces between becomes meaningless. Perhaps 50 years, perhaps 100. But we will not be alone." As he spoke, the Fire Children began to appear around them, not as the coal-black creatures they had become, but in forms that blended their original humanity with their supernatural transformation. They were still changed, still otherworldly, but no longer driven by the Soot Father's malevolent will. "We remember now," said the child who had first emerged from Mrs. Whitmore's fireplace. "We remember who we were before the darkness claimed us. And we remember that we chose this existence to escape something worse: poverty, abuse, starvation, death. But now we can choose again." Some of the Fire Children began to fade, their spirits finally finding the peace that had been denied them in life. Others chose to remain, becoming guardians alongside the three humans who had sacrificed themselves to save both worlds. And a few began to change again, their forms becoming more human as they slowly worked their way back toward the life they had lost. Mrs. Whitmore watched this transformation with wonder and sadness. Her own sacrifice had not been in vain, but she understood that she could never return to the simple existence she had known. She was part of something larger now, a guardian standing watch between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Years passed in the space between spaces, though time moved differently there than in the world above. Mrs. Whitmore and her companions watched through countless chimneys as the world changed around them. Gas lighting became common, then electric lights. Central heating began to replace individual fireplaces. The great sooty cities slowly grew cleaner as new technologies emerged. And gradually, the Fire Children found their own paths to redemption. Some returned to life as adults, using their supernatural knowledge to protect other vulnerable children. Others chose to remain as guardians, watching over the remaining chimney systems and ensuring that no other malevolent entities could establish themselves in the spaces between. Constance grew in wisdom and power during their exile, becoming something like a goddess of protection for lost children everywhere. She learned to reach beyond the chimney networks, extending her influence to any space where children might be endangered: alleyways and abandoned buildings, workhouses and factories, anywhere that innocence might be consumed by necessity. Mrs. Whitmore found her own role in this new existence, becoming a keeper of memories and stories. She chronicled the experiences of every child who had ever been transformed by the Soot Father's influence, ensuring that their suffering would never be forgotten and their courage would always be remembered. And Thomas Ashworth became their strategist and planner, using his knowledge of both worlds to identify and counter other supernatural threats before they could gain a foothold in human society. The decades passed, and slowly the binding began to weaken, not because it was failing, but because it was no longer needed. The world above had indeed changed beyond recognition. Chimneys were becoming obsolete, replaced by more efficient and safer heating systems. The vast networks of flues and passages that had once connected every building in every city were being sealed or demolished. The Soot Father's prison was shrinking with its former domain, and the entity itself was growing weaker as the source of its power diminished. Soon, Mrs. Whitmore realized, the binding would no longer require active maintenance. The creature would be trapped not by their sacrifice, but by its own obsolescence. "It's time," Ashworth said one day, though in their timeless realm, the concept of day was purely metaphorical. "The binding has become self-sustaining. We can return to the world above if we choose." Mrs. Whitmore looked around at the strange realm they had called home for so long. Most of the fire children had moved on, either returning to life or finding final peace in death. Only a few remained, and they had become something new, guardian spirits who watched over children in all the hidden places where danger might lurk. "What of Constance?" she asked, looking at her daughter, who had become beautiful and terrible in her transformation. "Can she return to a normal life?" Constance smiled, and in that expression Mrs. Whitmore saw both the 7-year-old child she had been and the ageless entity she had become. "I think," her daughter said slowly, "that I have found something better than a normal life. The children still need protecting, Mama. Not from chimney sweeps or supernatural entities, but from poverty and neglect, from abuse and exploitation. The world has changed, but the need for guardians remains." Mrs. Whitmore nodded, understanding. Her daughter had found her purpose in their strange exile, and that purpose would not be served by returning to mortality. "And what of you?" Constance asked. "Will you return to the world above?" Mrs. Whitmore considered the question carefully. She could return, she knew. She could reclaim her human form and live out whatever years remained to her in the changed world above. But what would she find there? Her old life was gone, her manor probably sold or demolished, her place in society erased by decades of absence. "I think," she said finally, "that I too have found something better than a normal life. Someone needs to remember the stories, to keep the history of what happened here. And someone needs to watch for signs that other entities might try to follow the Soot Father's example." Ashworth nodded approvingly. "Then we remain, the guardians of the spaces between, watching over both worlds to ensure that such horrors never rise again." And so they stayed, the three of them becoming legends whispered around fires that still burned in the remaining chimneys of the world. Children would sometimes claim to see faces in the flames, or hear voices in the smoke, speaking words of comfort and protection. Parents would dismiss these stories as imagination, never knowing how close to the truth their children had come. The Soot Father remained imprisoned in its crystalline cage, its power broken and its influence neutralized. The few fire children who remained had become something like angels, watching over the vulnerable and offering aid to those who needed it most. And in the spaces between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, three guardians stood eternal watch, ensuring that the boundary between worlds remained secure. Mrs. Evangeline Whitmore had begun that terrible night as a simple widow facing an impossible choice. She ended it as something far greater, a protector of children, a keeper of memories, and a guardian against the darkness that always seeks to consume innocence. Her sacrifice had saved not just her own daughter, but countless children who would never know how close they had come to a fate worse than death. In the years that followed, strange stories would occasionally surface in the newspapers of London and other great cities. Children found safe in abandoned buildings, speaking of kind voices that had guided them to shelter. Fires that refused to spread when they threatened orphanages or schools, as though some invisible force contained them. Cruel masters of child laborers who suffered mysterious accidents, leaving their young victims free to find better lives. Those who investigated such incidents found no rational explanation for these events. But sometimes, if they looked closely at the ashes of a cold fireplace or listened carefully to the wind through old chimneys, they might catch a glimpse of something that defied understanding. Faces in the soot, voices in the smoke, and the faint echo of ancient words that spoke of protection and love. The Fire Children had found their redemption at last, not through returning to their stolen lives, but by choosing to use their transformation in service of others. And their guardians remained vigilant, watching over all the lost and vulnerable children of the world, ensuring that innocence would never again be consumed by the darkness that dwells in the spaces between spaces. The chimney sweeps had become something far greater than anyone could have imagined, not victims of supernatural horror, but heroes who chose sacrifice over safety, love over self-preservation, and protection of the innocent over their own peace. Their story would be whispered for generations, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are those who will stand guard against the forces that seek to prey upon the young and helpless. And in the dying light of coal fires and the flickering flames of gas jets, children would sometimes catch glimpses of their protectors, figures of smoke and shadow who watched with loving eyes, ready to intervene whenever danger threatened. The Fire Children had become guardians at last, their eternal vigil a testament to the power of transformation through sacrifice and love. Thus ended the terror of the Soot Father, not with violence or destruction, but with the willing sacrifice of those who chose to stand between the innocent and the darkness. The chimneys of the world grew cold and silent, but they were no longer empty. They had become sanctuaries, watched over by angels made of ash and light, ensuring that no child would ever again be lost in the spaces between worlds.